Hello children and welcome back to my YouTube channel once again. Today we are going to study the poem A Legend of the Northland that belongs to Class 9 CBSE textbook Beehive. So let's get started. Now we need to know at the very outset what is a ballad, because A Legend of the Northland, this particular poem is a ballad. So a ballad is such kind of a poem which tells us a story, and that too it conveys a message. It is a part of folk culture and is passed on orally from one generation to the next. So this particular story narrates the legend of an old lady who was cursed by Saint Peter for being greedy. Now let us look at the summary of the poem. What happens in the story, in the poem? Now, as I said, this poem is a legend about an old lady who angered Saint Peter because of her greed. One day, Saint Peter was preaching around the world and reached the door of a cottage where this little woman lived. She was making cakes and baking them on a hearth. Saint Peter was fainting with hunger. He asked the lady to give him a piece of cake. The cake that she was baking then appeared to be too big to give away to Saint Peter. So what she did was she kept it for herself, and instead she baked another but smaller one this time. Now that also appeared to be too big to give away, so she did not give that to him. The second time she baked yet another smaller cake but found it again too big to give away. So in her third attempt, she took an extremely little scrap of dough and rolled it very flat. She had it as thin as a wafer, but still was unable to part with that. Now, what happened after that? This angered St. Peter a lot. He said that she was not fit to live in human form and enjoy food and warmth. He cursed her and transformed her into a woodpecker bird that had to bore in hard, dry wood to get its scanty food. She can be seen in the trees all day boring and boring for food. So now after the summary, let us look at the stanza-wise explanation. In stanza 1, the poet introduces the place which is the Northland, where the days are very short and nights are very long. It is so cold that people cannot sleep comfortably the whole night and often wake up for being unable to bear the temperatures. Now stanza 2. In this stanza, the poet continues to describe the people of the Northland. She says that when the snow falls, they like to go for sledging, and so they tie their reindeer up to their sledges. Because of the cold, children are made to wear heavy woolen clothes that make them look like the cubs of bears. Stanza 3. In this stanza, the poet talks about how parents in the Northland tell their children a story. Not only parents, it could be the elders, even the grandparents, the old people. The poet, she does not think the story is true, but that it should be told nonetheless, for it teaches children an important lesson. Stanza 4. In this stanza, the poet begins to tell the story. The story is about Saint Peter, who had traveled around the world preaching the word of God. Stanza 5. Here, Phoebe Carey continues the story. She describes how Saint Peter once came to a woman's house as she was baking cakes for herself. Stanza 6. Here, the poet describes how St. Peter's body was pale and tired at the end of a long day. To sustain himself, he asked the woman to give him only one of the many cakes that she was baking in her hearth. Stanza 7. In this stanza, the poet describes how the woman made a very small cake. But before she could give it to St. Peter, she started thinking that it was too big to be given away. Stanza 8. Here, the poet describes how the woman went on to make an even smaller cake, but how it looked as big as the first one to her. Stanza 9. In this stanza, the poet describes the woman's third attempt to make a cake so small that she wouldn't mind giving it away. This time she took an extremely small lump of dough, and when she rolled out the dough, her cake was as flat and thin as a wafer. However, she could not even bear to give that cake away. Stanza 10. In this stanza, the poet describes how the woman said that the cakes that seemed small when she herself ate them were all too big to be donated for no money. As a result, she ended up keeping all the cakes on the shelf and not giving any to Saint Peter. Stanza 11. In this stanza, the poet describes Saint Peter's reaction towards the woman. Saint Peter lost his temper finally, for he was hungry and weak and needed to have some food. It is not easy to anger a saint, but the selfish woman had been able to do so. Stanza 12. In this stanza, the poet describes how St. Peter had cursed on the selfish woman, telling her that she did not deserve to have such comforts of human life, such as warm fire, a house to live in, and good food to eat whenever she wanted. In stanza 13, the poet describes how St. Peter told the woman that she would have to build her own nest like birds do, and how she must dig holes into wood in order to get food to feed herself. In stanza 14, the poet describes how the woman went up through the chimney of her house, being speechless and shocked, and how she had been turned into a woodpecker. Stanza 15. Here, the poet describes how the woman had been wearing a red cap in human form, and how, as a woodpecker, her head was still the same shade of red in color. However, all the clothes she had been wearing seemed to have been burnt and had become black as a coal. Stanza 16. Here, the poet says that every schoolboy living in the village had seen this woodpecker digging into the bark of trees, looking for food to feed on. Now, coming to the theme of the poem. The poem is basically based on the theme that greed is a grave sin. The old lady's greed stopped her from sharing even her smallest cake with hungry St. Peter. Now, along with the theme of the poem, it teaches us basic values. So, what is the message that the poem conveys? The message that the poem conveys is that we should not be selfish, we should not be greedy. We human beings should at least possess the basic values, like helping others, sharing things with others, to be away from greed, etc., etc. The tone of the poem. So if we look at the tone of the poem narrates a legend of how St. Peter had cursed an old lady for being mean and stingy. So it has a sad ending, the curse finally changes the little woman to a woodpecker. So the tone can be said to be sad and melancholic. Sad and melancholic. Now look at the literary devices. So we have alliteration here. You have examples you can see in stanza 1, in stanza 2, stanza 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 13. So alliteration is something you all know. The sound in stanza 1, that, they, them. Here the sound is being repeated. So in the similar way, we have these repetition of the same sound in the same line. So that's why we have alliteration as a poetic device. The next is repetition. Repetition is when a word is or a phrase is used more than once in a poem. So stanza 1 has got the word away, which is being repeated. Stanza 9, rolled and rolled, is being repeated. And in stanza 13 and 16, boring and boring and boring. So this particular word has been repeated. Now look at the rhyme scheme of the poem. You can find it out yourself if you know the trick. Now coming to the next important literary device, a poetic device, it is called enjambment. Enjambment, as we know, that when a line continues to the next without any punctuation mark, that's called enjambment. So open the book, open the poem, and tally with it. Stanza 1, check line number 3 and 4, whether line 3 has got punctuation mark or not. Is it continuing to the next line, line number 4 or not? So please check all these lines mentioned in the stanzas mentioned here in the slide. And here simile, the next literary device, is very prominent. We have in stanza 2, the children look like bears' cubs. The children here are compared to, their appearance is compared to bears' cubs because of the woolen clothes. They are wrapped up with that because of the extreme cold. In stanza 9, baked as thin as a wafer. So the old lady bakes her cake as thin as a wafer, rolls it and, flattens it as thin as a wafer. So that's the comparison. And stanza 15, clothes were burned black as a coal. The color of the burnt clothes is compared to the black color of coal. So this is what I had to say about literary devices. And thank you all. And let me mention here that this PPT has been prepared by Utpreksha Kaishyap, one of my students from the batch 2019 when she was in class 9. So my explanation has been assisted by this particular slide made by Utpreksha Kaishyap. Thank you so much. I hope you all have understood the poem better.